Excellencies, distinguished panelists and guests, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this most important and timely discussion on the need for the new classification for Caribbean economies. My name is Riyad Medeb. I am the Senior Principal Advisor for Small Island Developing States at UNDP, and it is my honor to serve as moderator of today's side event and to welcome our esteemed speakers and panelists. Today's event seeks to spark a conversation and explore the prospect of moving beyond purely income-based classification for Caribbean economies towards categorization that more accurately capture the vulnerabilities and risk Caribbean's economy face. Characterized as a small island developing state, Caribbean economies share a set of common development challenges. While they exhibit varying level of human development, they are highly vulnerable to environmental and economic shocks. They experience low level of diversification and high level of public debt. The COVID-19 pandemic sent a shockwave through Caribbean economies, exacerbating this fiscal pressure. Particularly, the drastic decline in international tourism has devastated many Caribbean countries, as I'm sure we will hear more about from our panelists. Further to socio-economic challenges they face, the region is among the most vulnerable to adverse impact of climate change. But given their economy's classification, these countries are met with limitation in accessing development aid in the form of concessional credit or grant. And in the context of COVID-19, this limitation are a major constraint in the response and recovery effort, as well in their ability to accelerate economic transformation. So this afternoon, we are honored to be joined by a most excellent set of speakers and panelists who will take us through the challenges at hand, explore innovation solutions, pushing us to act beyond traditional development thinking and adapt to the complex reality of our age. Before moving to our panelists, it is my pleasure to welcome Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, Assistant Secretary General and UNDP Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean, to deliver opening remarks. Over to you, Mr. Lopez Calva.
Thank you very much, Riyad. Just a few minutes to introduce the concept and the idea behind this side event in this important ministerial meeting. I want to start by thanking Professor Ravi Kambur, who has contributed in many aspects of our thinking of development, but has been also involved very closely to the conversation on income and country classification by income and other potential dimensions. So it is going to be really interesting to hear from him how the thinking has been evolving at the global level. So thank you, Ravi, for participating in this meeting. And of course, I want to particularly thank Mr. Joseph Cox, the Assistant Secretary General for Trade and Economic Integration of CARICOM, Her Excellency Camilla Johnson-Smith, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade from Jamaica, and our dear Excellency Aubrey Webson, the Ambassador of Antigua and Barbuda, and the Chair of the Alliance of the Small Island States, with whom we have worked very closely as UNDP in the past years. And as you know, we feel very close to Sir Hilary Beckles and the University of West Indies. So again, it's an honor and a privilege to have you in this conversation. And my dear Daniel Titelman, a colleague from ECLAC, who has written extensively on this issue. So I just want to say that we have insisted that Latin America and Caribbean as a middle income region has not consolidated middle class societies. And the fact that the income classification still looks at that dimension, and even when we look at the HDI, sometimes that doesn't help, because then countries have, in a way, are punished in their access to many of the international sources of financing, and they don't have access to concessional financing. So there's several aspects why this matters. So the economic vulnerability, the social vulnerability could be one of the results of many other structural problems that are faced by these countries, particularly for the Caribbean. The fact that we have small island development states, or as we have recently would like to call them, large ocean states, but they face very particular types of vulnerabilities. By the way, I want to make today a recognition and to bring to our memories the fact that we are today celebrating the anniversary of the earthquake in Haiti, which is just another type of shock that, as you know, was devastating, and we're still recovering from it. So this is just one example of the many sources of vulnerability that the countries face. So we need to think different about how to classify countries in this respect, and how to classify them in order for them to have access to better conditions, to renegotiate debt, to have more fiscal space, and to respond more proactively to economic and social challenges that they face. So thank you, everybody, for being part of this conversation that is fundamental. And I will leave then the floor to Riyad to start the dialogue. But I want to really thank you very, very deeply from the UNDP, as institutionally as UNDP, for trusting us with your participation in this space. Thank you very much, Riyad.
Thank you very much, Luis Felipe, and thank you for insisting on trying to think differently and trying to find a way for a solution to fiscal space. I would like now to invite the partner of the side event, Mr. Tittelman. Our esteemed speakers will be talking mostly about the role of ECLAC in the region. Thank you, Mr. Tittelman. Oh, he's disconnected. Thank you very much. I think so. Mr. Tittelman is not online. I'll be inviting, in this case, Professor Ravi Kambur. Professor Ravi Kambur research and teach in development economics, public economics, and theory at Cornell University. He has previously taught at Oxford, Cambridge, Princeton, and has served as a senior staff of the World Bank, as mentioned by Mr. Luis Felipe. Professor Kambur will deliver the keynote address introducing us to the challenges that arise from the current narrowly income-based criteria for accessing development aid and the obstacles this presents to middle-income countries. Welcome, Professor Kambur. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me and can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed. So my thanks to the organizers for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. The title of my talk is "The Other Middle Income Trap: A Global Perspective." That's the brief outline of the talk, and I'm sure the PowerPoint will be made available to everybody after the talk. So the term middle income trap was coined by Karas and Gill in 2006 to suggest the possibility that countries newly graduated from low-income country status, LIC status, to MIC status, faced a series of challenges to continue their progress towards high-income status. Now, since then, a large technical and policy literature has developed, exploring the nature of this trap. The policy discourse has focused primarily on what MICs should be doing to escape the middle income trap. Now, there has been a particular attention on infrastructure investment, the hard variety and the soft variety, and also on institutional and governance reforms. But there has also been a somewhat smaller literature, I should say, on what the international community can do to help MICs escape the middle income trap. As Karas notes, given all the complexities of middle-income country development, there is surely a role for aid to help the transformations needed to avoid a middle-income trap. But here we face what might be termed the other middle-income trap, or the development assistance middle-income trap. Almost every development assistance agency has graduation, quote-unquote, criteria, driven primarily by per capita income, with the cutoff beyond which concessional aid flows start to taper off sharply and then stop. To take a leading example, just to give you one example, this is a leading example. The World Bank soft loan agency, IDA, has an operational cutoff. And here's the definition in the write-up. Eligibility for IDA support depends first and foremost on a country's GNI per capita being below an established threshold, first and foremost. And this threshold is updated annually, and it was actually $1185 in fiscal year 2021. Now, this is not exactly the LIC-MIC dividing line, which is 1035 GNI per capita, but it's not an unfair characterization, I would say, to say that with entry to MIC status, a country is well on the way to losing access to these IDA funds. There are, of course, other agencies with their own criteria, and we'll come to some of those later. And as I say, per capita income is not the only criterion that's used by agencies, and I'm going to discuss welcome but quite inadequate modifications that are underway. But it is the dominant criterion in the current development assistance mindset, and it is this mindset that needs to be changed. Now, in this discussion and in my presentation, I'm going to take a global perspective, highlighting the broad issues that arise the world over, leaving the specific discussion of the Caribbean for the distinguished panel that follows. So let me start by discussing performance and need. And there's a big picture question, which is how should scarce development assistance resources be allocated
you think,
across... Hello? Am I okay? Yes, I heard something in my... Sorry, yeah. So the big picture question we face is how should scarce development assistance resources be allocated across competing needs in a range of countries? Now, a classic distinction for the allocation of scarce resources, actually in any setting, is between need and performance. All else held constant, the greater the need, the higher should be the allocation. Similarly, all else held constant, the better the use of funds to address the need, the higher should be the allocation. This is a basic criteria. This is a basic principle that's applied actually even within countries. Now, performance-based allocation, PBA, has long been the mantra of development agencies, and the allocation formulae used by development agencies, like IDA, use indicators which are supposed to capture performance. Now, I should say this is not a controversy-free area, and there has been much written on the topic. For example, in my own earlier writings, I've argued that the performance component of the IDA allocation formula and the indicators that are used actually espouse a theory of development for which empirical support is not wholly convincing. But that's a separate issue. My focus in this presentation is not on the performance component of the PBA, of the performance-based allocation criteria, but on the need component, and of course the overarching indicator of it, namely per capita income. But if per capita income is the overarching indicator of need, how good an indicator of need is this per capita income indicator? And that's really, I'm going to take up 4 or 5 arguments in this direction. Let me start then with considering the connection between per capita income and poverty. Let's start with the official World Bank country income-based classifications and the World Bank's official absolute income poverty line. These are absolutely official criteria, classifications, and so on. Okay. If we use those things, then the following 2 facts are true. 30 years ago, 90% of the world's poor lived in low-income countries. Today, 75% of the world's poor live in middle-income countries. Let me just repeat that. Using absolutely official criteria and classifications, 30 years ago, 90% of the world's poor lived in LICs, but today, 75% of the world's poor live in MICs. Of course, the poor haven't moved, right? They have been reclassified. Or rather, the countries that they live in have been reclassified. And the fact of the matter is, again, I'm taking a global perspective here, is that over the last 3 decades, a number of large countries have grown fast enough to lift themselves into mixed status, but not sufficiently not sufficiently equitably enough to take large numbers of their poor into non-poverty status. So the geography of world poverty has changed dramatically. 30 years ago, the connection between a person being poor, as measured by the person being below the poverty line, and that person's country being poor, as measured by the country's per capita income being in low income status, was quite tight. This is no longer the case. And that, I think, leads us to rethink using per capita income as a criterion for need. And all of the above is for an absolute poverty line, a poverty line which does not change when, excuse me, in real terms, when the country's per capita income moves up. But I have to say that in the development literature, a consensus is developing that poverty in the income dimension should be a relative concept linked to the average income in that society. The conceptual foundations of this lie in Amartya Sen's capability theory, where well-being is seen in terms more fundamental than income, with income being only instrumental in achieving human dignity and flourishing. So while fundamental deprivation could be specified in absolute terms in the capability dimension, its translation into the income dimension is an additional step, which depends on a whole range of contingent factors. In particular, as societies develop and get richer on average, and in particular, if this is accompanied by rising inequality, the income that is needed at the lower end to achieve minimal dignity and flourishing will also change. This is the conceptual basis of the relative poverty argument, of the relative poverty line argument. And this conceptualization is actually implemented in practice. So this is not just a concept, it's actually implemented in practice in the European Union, for example, by making the poverty line in a country equal to 60% of the median income in that country. Now, there's a few technical things. It's actually the 60% of the equivalized disposable household income, but let's leave all the technical things to one side. The point is that when a country's income grows, the poverty line moves with it in response to Sen's fundamental conceptual arguments. So that's the first point, that the connection between per capita income and poverty needs to be rethought, and it's not as straightforward as it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago. The next point I want to emphasize, and this has been emphasized in the introductory comments as well, is the vulnerability. Now, in the previous section, I developed the idea that it is inappropriate to think of a country as being a single individual with the per capita income of that country. And I've highlighted variations around the average, and in particular, absolute and relative poverty. However, for purposes of argument, let us now indeed think of the country as a single person, to highlight conceptually another key sense in which per capita income fails as a measure of well-being and need. National income is volatile for reasons that are well known. To the traditional export fluctuations and tourism are now added climate-related risks and swings associated with global financial markets, over which any particular country has no control. Surely then, the average income of a country should be adjusted to account for this volatility in the same way as the average return from a portfolio, from a financial portfolio, is adjusted to account for risk. Now, I'm not going to go into the technical details. There is actually a standard formula for the risk premium, or so-called cost of risk, which I've given there, but I'm not going to go into it in terms of its technical details here. Just focus on the third bullet in that point, and this is really the point I want to make. The point is that in the national context, the cost of risk, in effect, gives us a relevant adjustment downwards of per capita income that is necessary to account for this cost. Technically, it involves the risk aversion and the standard deviation and so on and so forth, but let's leave all that to one side. The point is that just as in a financial portfolio, with risk, it is as if the country's per capita income were actually lower than shown in the official figures. That is the impact. That is the appropriate way to adjust for the impact of risk. We do that in finance all the time. Why shouldn't we do it in terms of country-level per capita incomes? So here's my next argument for why we should be rethinking the per capita income, tying assistance to per capita income quite so tightly. You know, in assessing individual well-being, a snapshot of the present can be an inadequate representation because it may not capture future expected trends. So again, turning to finance, an investor may buy an asset with a present low return, but in expectation of a high return in the future. And how do we deal with this? We take present discounted value or internal rate of return calculations, which convert the anticipated future flows into commensurate amounts in the present to compare with present costs and benefits. That's a standard procedure. And of course, if the projected returns are lower in the future than the present return, this adjustment also needs to be made to correct for the valuation of an asset say, in the context of finance. But why not apply this same logic at the country level? What about a country which has a relatively high, officially measured per capita income, as in the case of the countries that we're looking at, but whose future prospects are anticipated to be less than rosy because of factors outside its control? The most obvious case is obviously that of climate change. Quite apart from greater volatility immediately, which was the last section, which I've addressed in the last section, there is the prospect of lower per capita income in the future. This is all relative to trend, okay? There's the prospect of lower per capita income in the future. And of course, inexorable sea level rise for small island economies is the most vivid case of such a scenario, but we can think of many other as well. So this is not volatility. This is actually well-known, anticipated future issues that we know are going to arise. Of course, the consequences of climate change can be adapted towards with current investment in appropriate infrastructure, and there's a lot of discussion of adaptation and the investment that's needed. But therein lies the rub. Therein lies the rub. You see, an economy with a relatively high present per capita income needs investment to prevent future downturns in that per capita income as the result of a global public bad over which the economy has no control, like climate change, or indeed about financial volatility and so on. But the point is it cannot get access to development finance to undertake this investment precisely because of its present high per capita income. So in fact, we're projecting a decline or a relative decline in the future, but nothing can be done about it because of the current high per capita income. This is the catch-22 of the other middle income trap or the development assistance middle income trap. So let me take another example, moving away from the small island states type perspective, but consider the case of a large MIC, a large middle income country, which will not only suffer from the consequences of climate change, but whose emissions are a significant contributor to climate change. Mitigation measures in this large country are a global public good. But they will impose the mitigation measures will impose an immediate cost on the country. So the country bears the immediate cost. The benefits are a global public good distributed the world over. The world should want to incentivize this large middle-income country to undertake these measures. But again, current rules on development assistance for middle-income countries make this difficult, make this incentivization difficult because actually development assistance is meant to taper off for MICs according to current rules. So once again, the current over-reliance on per capita income as a guide is shown to be problematic. Let me now finally point to an aspect of the current classifications which is problematic, which is another element of the problem. Now, even if there was an argument for tight conditioning of development assistance on per capita income, and we have seen, and I've gone through strong counter arguments to this, even if we accept that, the point I want to make here is that the current design of graduation has another feature which is deeply problematic in my view. This is the cliff a country faces when it crosses the graduation threshold, with in principle a sharp fall off in access to development finance at the graduation threshold. Now, of course, we've all had experience in operational experience, and there are, of course, some operational advantages to creating well-defined categories such as LICs and MICs and so on. But the sharp tapering of aid at the crossover point does not allow countries, in my view, to plan appropriately. Of course, in practice, and again, as someone who has operational experience would know, in practice, the actual graduation process is indeed smoother than this. For example, for IDA, a country enters the graduation process when its per capita income has been above the operational cutoff for 3 years in a row. It doesn't happen all of a sudden. And as we see for the UN, it's actually 6 years. It's 2-3 3-year review periods. Now, this of course gives time, but the cliff at the given income level, in my view, still remains. It happens a little bit over time, but still there's a drop off after that income level. So if there is to be a fall off in development assistance as per capita income rises, in my view, it should be a smooth tapering as a function of income rather than in the form of a cliff. Now, the arguments that I put forward, I believe, are strong counter-arguments to the sole reliance on per capita income and also the sharp categorization of the thresholds. And of course, these have been taken into account in the operational setting, as I hinted at before, to some extent. So to quote from the IDA provisions, IDA also supports some countries, including several small island economies, that are above the operational cutoff, but lack the credit worthiness needed to borrow from the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD. The point is that this barely addresses the critiques that were laid out in the previous sections. Now, other agencies, like the UN, have moved further in the direction of modifying the pure income criterion. The UN's classification, again, I'm sure you're familiar with this, the UN's classification of least developed country now depends on 3 criteria: per capita income, a human assets index, and the economic vulnerability index. And, of course, one can discuss further the details of these 2 supplementary indices. We can have lots of technical discussions about whether they combine the right things in the right way, et cetera, et cetera. But I would say that this is a welcome advance in broadening the concept of need for development assistance. However, a closer look at the details of even this broadened UN LDC criteria would make clear, I think, that income per capita still retains pole position in determining graduation. It is still, I think, a dominant, if not the dominant aspect. Let me illustrate by giving you 2 examples. One is the so-called income-only exception in the graduation criteria. And what is the income-only exception? The income-only exception arises when the per capita GNI of a country, the per capita gross national income of a country, is at least twice the graduation threshold in 2 consecutive triennial reviews. Let me take you through that step by step. The income graduation threshold for the UN is the LIC threshold, the low income country threshold of 1035. Twice that is 2070. So if a country's GNI per capita exceeds 2070 over 2 3-year review periods, it ceases to be a least developed country and loses access to development assistance associated with that status, irrespective of what happens to the other 2 indices. So irrespective of what happens on human assets or what happens on vulnerability, if your income is more than twice for over this review period, then that's it. It's the income-only exception. The only thing that matters is income. In fact, second example, and this is the last bullet on that page, the UN also has the so-called 2 out of 3 rule for graduation. So a country which crosses the 1035 threshold and crosses one of the other thresholds for either for human assets or vulnerability graduates, even if for the third index, the third criterion, actually there are plainly problems with it. So if it crosses the income threshold and the human assets threshold, but vulnerability is still a problem, it nevertheless graduates. So let me conclude my presentation by saying, what are the next steps that we should be taking? What are the next steps that we should be taking? I would say that while movements in the right direction are obviously welcome, I would say that we are still in a mindset dominated by per capita income as the main indicator of need. And the cliff still remains. An appropriate response, I would say, in light of the critique advanced in the previous sections, would be to move much more strongly in the direction of these four things, and a lot of technical work would be needed to flesh out these directions. Firstly, we should be thinking about adjusting the relationship between per capita income and poverty by using a relative poverty line, which moves with per capita income. Secondly, we should be adjusting the per capita income criterion to take account of risk and vulnerability along the lines of the cost of risk or risk premium, which we do regularly, which we do routinely in the world of finance and financial portfolios. Thirdly, we should adjust the per capita income criterion for known negative future trends. And this is, again, what we do routinely in the financial concept when we take a present discounted value. Okay. If there are negative future trends, it is clearly inappropriate to be using today's per capita income as the sole criterion. And finally, I believe we should be adjusting the flow of development assistance more smoothly to the modified per capita income criterion so that countries don't face a cliff in resource flows being shut off. I would argue that these adjustments would serve to mitigate the other middle income trap or the development assistance middle income trap as a further addition to the middle income trap holding back the development of mix to HIC levels of development. I believe that the development assistance middle income trap is a further type of trap that middle income countries face alongside the other traps which have indeed been discussed in the policy and technical literature. Those are some references. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your thought-inspiring presentation of our topic at hand, Professor Kambur, and the global perspective of the other middle income trap you presented. I was really interested by the fact when you mentioned that regarding the cliff that many countries face when crossing the graduation threshold accurately illustrate the problematic many Caribbean economies face. And you also bring up the vulnerability to climate change and how this brings about future instability that is outside this country control. Caribbean countries among the most vulnerable to climate change face this exact issue. And I really like your 4 points at the end. What could we do now? And that was very clear way of finding a solution and also opening the discussion for our panel. Before moving to our panel, I would like to invite Mr. Tittelman. Mr. Tittelman, Daniel Tittelman is the Chief of the Economic Development Division of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I'm sorry, but there were some technical problems that kept me frozen during the first part of this meeting. And I'm sorry, I was here standing looking at my computer and didn't know what to do. So I'm sorry. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And on myself and on behalf of Alicia Bárcena, we're very happy to participate in this event. Just listening to the professor and unfortunately, and what probably Luis Felipe said about the vulnerability of Caribbean seeds, we completely agree that per capita income measures fail to be a measure of needs, but also to be a measure of the level of development and the needs that countries, and also a measure of how should be the criterion for allocation of financing for development or the cooperation flows or the trade preference for countries. In that respect, we have developed in ECLAC an approach, a methodological approach that we call a structural gap approach, where exactly basically we try to get the vulnerabilities and the structural gaps that put limits to the capacity of development of countries and use those gaps as the criteria for FFD allocation, ODA allocations, and trade preference. So in this sense, I completely agree with the professor that income per capita is not a good measure of needs or the development stage of countries. However, when you are graduated or you are categorized as a middle income country or high income countries, you lose a lot of your access facilities to financing for development, concessional flows, grants, or trade preference. And that categorization becomes a door and a constraint for countries to access the needed financial resources to foster development. Caribbean seeds have structural vulnerabilities to economic shocks, to natural and climate change shocks that need the cooperation of the world. The pandemic has shown us how income inequalities, very strong dependency on commodity trade and tourism, and some more structural issues have affected the way the pandemic has affected the Caribbean countries. So in this sense, it's a key element to start rethinking the way and the criteria we're going to use to allocate financial resources, particularly the cooperation schemes and concessional aids or ODA or other type of trade facilities, and start building up the new criteria and new instruments for a financial allocation and financial access of Caribbean seats. In this respect, we think this a key element is to build resilience to economic shocks and to climate change and natural shocks. And for that, for example, in ECLAC, we have proposed some innovative financial mechanism. One is a debt swap for climate change, but linked to the creation of resilient fund. The money you can reduce from debt services or attract from a financing for development perspective should be directed to create a resilient fund that can help green investment and build resilience. So in this sense, I completely agree with the spirit and the scope of this seminar, and we really support this initiative in the sense that it's to think and to foster inclusive development in the Caribbean countries. It's a key element is to change the criteria for allocation of financial resources, particularly in the cooperation sphere. And for that, it is very important to change the criteria of the middle income and start using, like we propose in our many work, the structural gap issues and try to figure out where the vulnerabilities are, what are the gaps that are constraining development, and use those criteria to start allocating financial resources. That's basically what I wanted to say, and thank you very much, and I'm sorry I couldn't participate at the beginning of the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Titelman, and thank you for addressing the one of the most important thing, which is how to address the structural gaps. And thank you for informing us also of the development of the debt for swap and climate for swap and your resilience fund. I would like to thank Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, Mr. Titelman and Professor Kambur for setting the stage of our discussion, which is leading us now to our panel discussion. It is my pleasure to welcome our first panelist, Honorable Kamina Johnson-Smith, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade of Jamaica. Senator of Honorable Kamina Johnson-Smith was reappointed as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade in 2020 as the first female minister to serve in this role. As Foreign Minister, Senator Johnson-Smith has represented Jamaica and the region at numerous bilateral, regional, hemispheric, and international fora. Senator Johnson-Smith is an attorney at law who worked previously in private practice and as corporate in-house counsel. Highly committed to both public services and volunteerism, the minister has also served in various capacities in the area of political leadership and philanthropy. In Minister Johnson-Smith, warm welcome to the panel. In May 2020, Jamaica is, along with Canada, co-convened the Financing for Development in the Area of COVID-19 and Beyond initiative, a collaborative effort to enable discussion on concrete proposals to overcome challenges in 6 issues areas. This discussion brought particular awareness to the issues facing middle-income countries and especially small island developing states in accessing financing for development. Minister, I would like to ask, what are your perspectives on the impact from the COVID-19 fallout on regional economies? Is the region discussing in the approach to meeting these challenges?
Good afternoon, everyone. To my distinguished panelists, my distinguished convener and moderator, it is a pleasure to join this panel for this most timely discussion. The hope for prosperity that usually attends the start of a new year has long been tempered by the challenges of 2020, and we've only been a week and a half in. 2020 continues to cast long shadows, and we now are faced with this reality. Indeed, the economic prospects for the Caribbean have worsened as the region continues to grapple with the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. A snapshot of the region in 2020, drawing on data from ECLAC and other sources, highlights, among other things, a decline in FDI by nearly 45 to 55%, estimated to be its lowest since 2005, an estimated 23% reduction of foreign trade, while at the domestic level, the revenue from international trade was down some 32%, near cessation of tourism and airline movements for almost the entire year, resulting in an almost 100% contraction of the hospitality sector, with travel tax receipts falling by nearly 80%, and debt to GDP ratios for the majority of the Caribbean that are above the 60% threshold for sustainability, and for 3 countries in excess of their GDP. Admittedly, while the prognosis is somewhat better now than initially forecast when we entered this crisis, the stark reality is that systemic deficiencies exist and have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Already high deficits and debt in the region have negatively impacted the ability of countries to address daily operations of government, much less to finance development and achieve the SDGs. Furthermore, being the second most climate vulnerable region in the world, we bear the recurrent cycle of capital cost and indebtedness caused not by profligacy, but infrastructure damage caused by severe weather events, many of which do not even reach international headlines. These circumstances collectively ground our unique vulnerability and our belief in the need for reclassification of our economies for the purposes of determining access to grant funding, the terms and costs of debt, and other related matters so intrinsic to recovery. In Jamaica, our situation was significantly buffered by the positive macroeconomic adjustments made immediately prior to the pandemic, or rather in the years leading up to the pandemic. Our strategic avoidance of full lockdowns in response to the pandemic, recognizing the realities of our societal and economic structures, together with the passage of legislation to adjust fiscal rules, also served us well. Given the continued fallout from the pandemic and the reality of our protracted economic crisis, it is noteworthy for our region that the issues of development financing and debt sustainability have been brought to the forefront of the international community's focus. While global leadership acknowledges that no one must be left behind, there have been no debt relief initiatives or new funding solutions allocated for middle-income countries like those in the Caribbean. In addition, there appears to be limited interest among advanced and developed countries to provide additional funding, either through special drawing rights allocation and/or World Bank capital increases. Accordingly, many middle-income countries continue to face the very great and grave possibility of a systemic debt crisis, with many sovereign and corporate defaults in the 2021-22 financial period, and perhaps even in the medium term. In the totality of these circumstances, it is of great importance that we move expeditiously towards forging a fresh consensus, a global consensus, in respect of the classification of middle-income countries, including small island developing states of the Caribbean. As we bring our various perspectives to the possible modalities of a new classification for Caribbean economies, I wish to just share a few points for consideration. Firstly, we have long maintained our position on revamping the designation and our graduation of states by integrating vulnerability metrics. Put simply, GDP alone does not give a true reflection of development status nor the fragility of an economy, especially in the Caribbean. During the current pandemic, such calls have taken on an additional urgency, presenting perhaps an opportune time for the international community to revisit and change the development financing landscape for small states, and in particular vulnerable countries such as exist in the Caribbean. That we could now use a metric that is truly fit for purpose. Secondly, Broad acceptance in the global financial community is important for this as any other new responding initiative. We very much hope that the participation of relevant agencies and institutions, including the UNDP, in this important dialogue will promote the level of sensitization required to facilitate the creation of a reliable vulnerability index to be used to rank all countries based on a set of agreed parameters. This index would need to be transparent, dynamic, and allow for easy comparison across countries. Thirdly, we do not need to start from scratch. Work has been done in this area, but there's nothing like an idea whose time has come. The case for advancing the use of vulnerability and resilience indices for use in development financing was most recently made in September 2020 at the high-level forum convened by the Commonwealth Secretariat and the Alliance of Small Island States. The forum encouraged the United Nations to work more closely with the Commonwealth Secretariat, AOSIS, the Caribbean Development Bank, Pacific Island Forum, and other multilateral agencies to this end. Jamaica continues to encourage this engagement and also examined this approach in the context of our Financing for Development initiative, co-convened with Canada in the context of the UN, and which was just referred to. Fourthly, Jamaica reaffirms our long-term commitment to fiscal responsibility and prudent economic management. While calls continue to be made for IFIs and credit rating institutions to make policy adjustments which acknowledge the fallout from the pandemic and prevent further economic failure, we do believe that the Caribbean must also continue to set and maintain benchmarks for fiscal responsibility, provide enabling environments for good business practices to aid job creation and sustainable recovery, and as always, to defend our credibility in what is a highly competitive global environment. Ladies and gentlemen, as I close, the huge task of global recovery from the multidimensional impact of COVID-19 cannot be achieved without measures to address the debt and liquidity issues of vulnerable developing countries. A new system of classification for Caribbean economies will have a cross-cutting positive impact on the rebuilding of our economies and the achievements of the SDGs. Let us harness the opportunity in this crisis. I trust that through continued engagement such as these, we can move expeditiously towards introducing appropriate mechanisms to open up access to vital financial resources. This is absolutely necessary for recovery. I thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Minister Johnson Smith, for being in the panel and discussion. And thank you for insisting on the fact that rebuilding the economies, we need to have a new system of classification and adopting vulnerability metrics. This is the opportunity that we have. This is the right moment that we need to move on that. It is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Joseph Cox, Assistant Secretary General, Trade and Economic Integration of CARICOM. Assistant Secretary General Cox is an applied economic consultant and advocate with a career spanning 30 years. Throughout his career, he has served in many high-level roles promoting on economic development and growth in Jamaica. Among his recent contributions to regional development, he has authored the book, The New Normal, a Post-COVID Prime for Business. He's also developed and received unanimous approval from the Council of Trade and Economic Development for the strategy to reopen the region's economics during the COVID-19 pandemic. Assistant Secretary General, thank you very much for joining. My question to you is, what particular vulnerability and risk characterize Caribbean economies, and how can a move toward a new classification, as mentioned by the Honorable Minister, for that will respond to the structural challenges?
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. As I also extend my greetings to the distinguished panelists and, of course, distinguished audience listening to this webinar. Now, you asked me what are the particular issues, like vulnerabilities that face the region in this respect. And in answer to your question, what it strikes me is that as I listen to the keynote, and mention was made of the other middle income trap and the development assistance middle income trap, what struck me at that point in time is that that's the first time for a while that we can actually use acronyms to accurately characterize what has been impacting us as a region. Because the plain truth of it is that what we are looking at now is that we're looking at an issue where if we're not careful, we're caught on the horns of what I call developmental paralysis, whereby the rigid adherence to the per capita income metric has managed to really stymie the growth and development of the region. Now, when in answering your question particularly, I'm looking at issues whereby when we look at some of the metrics, the defining metrics for the region, we're looking at scenarios whereby 40 to 60% of the economies are informal, 50 to 60% of what we would characterize as a working poor. Our fiscal multipliers are characteristically weak. Private sector absorption is weak. Macro fundamentals by and large happen to be weak. Exogenous shock risk is very high, and we have high levels of replacement investment. And a lot of that replacement investment is occasioned by the climate change and the vagaries of climate change, whether it be rain, flooding, or hurricanes, or what have you. Because the other part of it is that we have to recognize that, for example, in the case of Dominica, in a couple of hours, the passage of a hurricane that lost over 200% of GDP, Montserrat has been very severely impacted by volcanic activity, and a substantial portion of that island, as at this point in time, is not really habitable. And right now, as we speak, even though we do hope and pray that it doesn't come to fruition, Seven Grenadines also has its own challenges with volcanic activity. So the point is simply this, that Chair, as we look at this issue, one of the things we have to always keep in mind is that the vulnerability of the region is not just in terms of its macroeconomic fundamentals, but there are also social and, in fact, what we would call climate change vulnerabilities that we have to take into consideration. And therefore, for us, when we speak about 1.5 degrees to stay alive, it is not just a slogan, but a statement which highlights the existential crisis that faces at least the region, or some elements of our region, which have emanated from our climate change crisis. Now, when we look at it as it is now, and this is where I absolutely agree with the points that Minister Johnson Smith has made, we have to realize that all CARICOM member states, with the exception of Haiti, have been classified as middle or high-income states, which is indicative of the level of economic and social progress that they have achieved over time. This classification is occasioned with the graduation of many of these countries from access to concessional multilateral funding as well as ODA, which they badly need to build resilience and finance sustainable development. Graduation has therefore exacerbated their developmental challenges and led to a debilitating debt burden as they are forced to borrow to cover the development financing gaps, where you have instances of uncreditworthiness and a lack of fiscal space over time. And Chair, I would hasten to point out that as we now looking towards vaccinations or vaccines being available to treat with COVID, the reality of life is that we also have to be very mindful that on the back of the post-COVID environment, we are likely to see a scenario where even in the private markets, when financial markets, when persons are doing their assessment of sovereign risk, because of the exposure and the vulnerabilities of the economies to COVID, which have been exposed by COVID, you'll find that the sovereign risk ratings are likely to increase and therefore put a further constraint on effective access to finance. It has been argued that while middle-income organizations signals some economic and social progress for these states, in reality, they still require access to concessional multilateral funding and ODA for economic and climate resilience building, disaster reconstruction, and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. Now, continued access to concessional funding will avoid instances of degradation and the buildup of indebtedness being incurred to address development priorities, including disaster reconstruction. CARICOM states would therefore be calling for the early formulation of appropriate eligibility criteria for broader access to concessional multilateral funding and official development assistance, which take account of these inherent vulnerabilities of the small states and the need to secure funding for resilience building, both economic and climate, as well as for disaster reconstruction. The containment measures adopted by CARICOM states in response to the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in a financing gap by some estimates anywhere between 3 to 4 billion US dollars and has further exacerbated resource mobilization fragilities confronting CARICOM states. Now, this gap does not include some of the reconstruction costs and that may be required to address the ravages of the several hurricanes that have impacted in some form or shape several parts of our region. As the world's most exposed travel and trade dependent region, CARICOM economies are expected to contract by anywhere between 5 and 20% for 2020 when the data comes in, with a relatively slow turnaround in 2021, given the protracted nature of the pandemic. Now, nevertheless, many CARICOM states cannot benefit from the debt relief and emergency financing facilities announced by the multilateral financial institutions with the support of advanced countries. These initiatives have targeted the poorest countries, and most CARICOM states do not qualify for access because of their classification as high or middle income states. Now, development partners such as Norway and the United States have offered to support temporary access to financing, which is clearly a step in the right direction. But the reality of life is that when we are looking at both the initiative that has been promulgated by the World Bank and others, the fact of life is that CARICOM states continue to urge their development partners to acknowledge the quest for access to concessional development financing as they strive to meet the 2030 SDGs, notwithstanding the COVID-19 crisis. Development partners are also being asked to extend their political support when decisions are to be made at the level of the boards of the multilateral financial institutions and the OECD. And in closing, Chair, I would just like to point out that this is not a case where we are looking at, as Minister Johnson Smith has quite correctly put on the table, we are not looking for anybody to reinvent the wheel. A substantive amount of work has been done on the development of vulnerability indices. So it's a matter now for there to be effective engagement where we can come up with a defined set of criteria that we can use across the board that will be able to really respond to the challenges that countries may face, and rather than being caught on the horns of a dilemma where we are so rigidly adhering to one single metric, which data and time has revealed is completely unreliable and does not really address the vicissitudes of economic development in an environment of serious climate change and other activities, not the least of which, of course, includes the COVID-19 pandemic. So with that, Mr. Chair, I would like to close, and I thank you for your engagement.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary General Cox. It is important to mention that for your key message, the eligibility criteria for access to concessional financing need to be revised, need to be linked to the triptych of vulnerability, which are economic, social, and climate. And a lot of work was done already in the Caribbean regarding multidimensional vulnerability index. And we do not need to reinvent the wheel, but we need to build on what is already done in the region in order for the country to have access to concessional financing and also to recover. Thank you very much. I would like now to hand the floor over His Excellency Dr. Aubrey Wesson. Dr. Aubrey Wesson is the current permanent representative to the United Nations of Antigua and Barbuda since 2014. Prior to his work at the United Nations, worked for several international non-governmental organizations. Since at the United Nations, the ambassador Webson has held several high-level positions. He continues to sit on several UN committees, including committee responding to the challenge of COVID-19, and he has since 2021 served the role as chair of the Alliance of Small Island States. Your Excellency, Ambassador Webson, it is an honor to count you in your participation in this panel. As your fellow panelists have spoken on the specificities of the Caribbean region, and we heard a broader global focus from our keynote speaker, Professor Kambur, I would like to ask you, how do you see the prospect of moving toward a universal index for accessing vulnerability beyond income level?
Thank you, Riyadh. Honorable Foreign Minister Johnson, Deputy Secretary General in CARICOM, Sir Hilary, Beckles, colleagues. First of all, thanks to the really good and exciting keynote in emphasizing, and as you have heard from the Foreign Minister and the Deputy Secretary General, much of what we have been sounding for several years. In the last 3 years or so, the countries of the Caribbean and SIDS in general, we have experienced some of the worst devastating effects of climate change. You've heard a lot of emphasis on the destruction of our economies as a result of climate change. We have had in the Caribbean and in the Pacific significant damage from hurricanes, some of the strongest hurricanes experienced in Dominica. You heard reference of that, Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Fiji, Vanuatu, and so on. SIDS have faced many challenges, including the highest adaptation cost per capita of any countries in the world. The rising incidence of shocks, tornado shocks, continue to be wished away, and it is the most important negative trend in international development, and it disproportionately affects SIDS. The evidence is clear, and the assessment of the last global financial crisis and the current global economic crisis, the current global pandemic, and a slew of environmental disasters make it difficult for SIDS to see any real short or medium-term growth. These challenges have increased the pressures on SIDS to continue to call for access to multiple sources of finance in order to compensate for funding gaps that exist and are forced on us that are no fault of ours. Soaring inequality across SIDS, high debt levels, complex financing processes, overlapping program and limited capacity are all results for our vulnerability. I was very interested in the keynote speaking of not only the vulnerability that we so often focus on our climate, brought on by our geographical position, which I will come back to, but also the vulnerability of scarce resources and human resources. We have one of the best universities in the world in the Caribbean, along with a number of other universities. I wonder if we know how many of our trained and our graduates remain with us or we lose to other parts of the world which then continues to create pressures on island states like ours in the Caribbean, because and add to the vulnerability of scarce resources, scarce human resources. As small states, we have presented numerous options, with the most practical being the application of a vulnerability index. We have been talking here a lot about that. We have presented ways to define that index, and we ask ourselves, what will it take for the world to truly change and respond to this? Because SIDS are not homogeneous. Some of us, as you have been hearing already, are LDCs. The majority of us are MICs, and a few of us are high income, which puts us in a unique place. The only method that we feel that enables equal financial access across all SIDS would be to come up with a vulnerability index that goes beyond income levels as a measurement. We have heard much of that. The main question here is how we do that. How would we build that index? There are several before us, several before the financial community, the world financial community, and we propose to introduce accelerating new approaches. We want to bring these indices that are already out there together. There is not, and to look at the special circumstances of SIDS. And there are special circumstances already defined. And we need to be able to take those special groupings of countries and the decisions on vulnerabilities, which are already there, that should be based on things like the international accepted definition of what makes us SIDS. Therefore, a vulnerability index should be based on our particular physical location, our small size, and exposure to social and economic and environmental shocks. And these should also constitute internal and external factors that creates these shocks. The measurement should also take these factors into account, the size and frequency of these shocks. So it's not just that we are vulnerable because we are exposed to hurricane, but as I think the foreign minister mentioned, we are exposed to hurricane year after year, and therefore our economy is turned backwards year after year. The degree of exposure to these shocks should be measured, and the capacity of the SIDS to respond to these shocks. And do we have the ability to build resilience to these? So the keynote address that we heard an hour ago, building on some of those points that was made by the professor, we need to take those factors and look at the different, not just the general positions that we face in our geographical position, not just the fact that we are exposed, but also how often do we face these things? What are the external and internal factors that account for these vulnerabilities that we face? We have spoken many, many times, and we at the United Nations are making, I think, key steps towards this vulnerability. But this now is the time for action. We have been speaking a lot, and in a strange way, out of adversity can come opportunity. And out of the pandemic, should we hope come the opportunity that the world will finally listen to what small island states. We were the ones who led the world in the 1990s into taking climate change much more seriously than
at any other time, that now people are beginning to look up. We want them also to take our plea for a vulnerability index to measure our survival. Otherwise, we are going to find ourselves into greater trouble. We will never accomplish the 2030 agenda if the vulnerability index is not deployed now as a measurement, and we get rid of the single economic measurement that is used. I thank you.
Son, we heard your message for action now, for action in developing a vulnerability index, taking into account the reality of the SIDS, taking into account the fact that the vulnerabilities are dynamic, and taking into account something which is very important is the frequency of the shocks that you are facing and the capacity of the countries to respond to the shocks. I would like now to invite Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, who will talk mostly on his perspective as Vice Chancellor of University of West Indies. Sir Hilary Beckles is a distinguished academic, international thought leader, United Nations Committee official, and global public activist in the field of social justice and minority empowerment. In 2007, Sir Hilary was made a Knight of St. Andrews, and he highlighted national honors in Barbados for his contribution to higher education, the art and sport. Professor Sir Hilary, in your perspective as academic, I would like to ask you two parts of the question. What is the rationale for a special policy curve out for development support to the Caribbean? And in particular, what role should the university sector play in the development pathway of the Caribbean and other SIDS nations in relation to the question of a new classification for these economies?
Thank you so very much. My friend, it's good to hear you and to be a part of this conversation and to pay respects to my distinguished colleague, the Honorable Luis Lopez Calva. Always good to be in conversation with you. And to our keynote address, Professor, thank you so very much. And of course, all of my distinguished colleagues from the region who have participated in this panel. I speak as an economic historian of this region, the Caribbean world, and indeed the wider Atlantic world of development and modernity. And I would wish to begin by noting that this conversation about reclassification is really indeed an endpoint of an earlier conversation that started 40 years ago, in which this region, on the verge of moving into its independence era and moving away from the colonial project, requested and asked for and discussed and insisted upon an appropriate classification. The conversation about the inadequacy of the classification which was offered has resulted in a 40-year discourse that has reached this moment at this time. We have heard of the inadequacy of the classification in respect of promoting Caribbean development, but the discourse has really been about why the region was not appropriately classified in the first instance, on the verge of embracing development as a transformational process in the 1960s and in the 1970s. We have to historicize to understand where we have reached. We have to historicize to understand how we are planning a future trajectory. I remember reading a speech given by Dr. Eric Williams in London on the verge of Trinidad's independence constitutional reform. And he said the European countries are treating the Caribbean like an orange. When he was pressed to explain what he meant by that, he said, well, Europe has sucked us dry and thrown the peel onto the ground. And now their only concern is that they might slip upon it. That was 60 years ago. And the conversation has been going on and on about how the Caribbean world, its uniqueness, it's been at the center of Western development, how the Caribbean was the place where Europe perfected its extraction of wealth under colonialism, and the Caribbean was indeed sucked dry, as Dr. Williams has suggested. And all of this followed the region into its independence agenda. I want to emphasize that because the Caribbean, after 4 centuries of wealth extraction that has enriched the European nations, and to some extent later on the United States, after all of that very determined and focused extraction from the Caribbean, and the Caribbean was classified as the premier extraction source of colonial wealth in the world. And remember, the Caribbean is still a colonized space. The Caribbean is still one of the few remaining colonized spaces in the world. So our nation building project is not yet complete. Some of the largest islands in the Caribbean are still colonies of Europe, one colony of the United States. We are still known to be a colonized space. So we are discussing reclassification at a moment in history when the region has not yet exited colonization and has not completed its nation building journey. So what we are seeing and what we are hearing, we have just heard from our colleagues, that the inadequacy of the classification model, the evidentiary basis of that, has now collided with an ethical crisis. So what we have now is 40 years of a discourse about inadequate classification cascading to a level where the Caribbean is now the center of a moral and ethical crisis, not only in this hemisphere, but in the Western world altogether. It's an embarrassment what has happened to the Caribbean. Now, we are not speaking about the Caribbean in search of any special exemption. The people of the Caribbean are not calling for any form of mendicant subordination. They have brought attention to the world of the specific nature of the region, the challenges of being small nations, the challenges of being colonized nations, the challenges of associated with the legacies, the pressing legacies of economies that were built to serve colonial and not national interests. And finally, the issues surrounded all of the changes that we have seen in the world of late, the financial crisis of 2007-2008, the issues of climate change. All of these have cascaded into a circumstance that is beyond the control of these very vulnerable nations that have been the source of maximum wealth extraction for many centuries. And we are looking, therefore, at how to resolve this ethical issue. Now, we should begin by recognizing that the COVID-19 was really the hurricane of 2020. While we were spared a hurricane of devastation in 2020, and we've had them in 16, 17, 18, then we were spared in 2020, but in its place came the COVID. So we were spared the ill wind of a hurricane in 2020, but in its place came a virus of even greater impact. And so we now speak of this, what we call the triple C, the chronic diseases. The Caribbean has the greatest per capita incidence of chronic diseases in the world. The hypertension, type 2 diabetes, it is the highest per capita in the world. That's the first C. Now we have the climate change, and we've heard the impact of climate change and the destruction of GDP in this region. And on top of the chronic diseases, on top of the climate change, we now have the COVID-19. And all of this has been happening year by year with an intensity in the Caribbean that is absolutely unique in the world. There is no place in the world that has had the cascading, the collision of these structures and forces articulated systematically, so devastating economies that have already been historically vulnerable. So, but in this call for special and concessionary funding, the call for debt relief, debt cancellation, all of these conversations that I have said are of an ethical nature, not just an economic strategic nature, but of a moral and ethical nature in the context of Caribbean and its history. We have to speak about the use of these resources in order to restructure our economies, in order to diversify our economies, in order to create a new economic agenda that will create the basis for sustainability. And clearly, we have to build this upon the context of research. We have to build this in the context of science and technology. We have to build this in the context of creating structures for new industries within a knowledge economy. And in order to do so, we have to look critically at the function and the role of research, of science and technology application, of higher education, and the application of the benefits of higher education to industrial development and transformation. So let us understand that we have to speak in terms of the future economy. We have to look at the energy manufacturing sector. We have to look at the blue economy sector. We have to look at greater sophistication in our financial services sectors. But in all of these, we have to realize that the Caribbean, precisely because it is still a colonized space, precisely because it has had the greatest extraction of its wealth over previous hundreds of years, the Caribbean has the lowest enrollment in higher education in this hemisphere. So when I speak to Luis within the context of UNDP and the hemispheric agenda, bear in mind that your most vulnerable nations and spaces are precisely those with the lowest enrollment in higher education, with the lowest higher education capacity in our entire hemisphere. And this is not just a statistical demonstration. We have to recognize that clearly, and I'm sure our economist friends would agree, that the potential of these countries, or any country, for development and transformation, especially in the 21st century, digitally driven knowledge economies, is an expression of the percentage of your citizens who have had higher education, who have had skills development, who have had professional training. And in that regard, the Caribbean is at the lowest in the entire hemisphere. From Alaska to Argentina, we in the Caribbean have the lowest capacity and enrollment in the sector that matters most at this stage. In the sector that matters most at this stage, the capacity for professional training, skills development, and for the higher education, the academic and professional mind. What attracts international capital into this region is precisely availability of skills, availability of the appropriate capacity to allow capital to accumulate. What is holding back our region is not so much a shortage of capital in and of itself, it's the combination of the shortage of capital plus the shortage of skills. And that is a devastating relationship that is holding back this region. And I would argue, therefore, that when we speak about the need for concessionary funding, when we speak of debt forgiveness and debt abolition, when we speak of that relationship, we have to focus on restructuring, diversifying the Caribbean economy for the future to place it on a more sustainable basis. And a critical part of that is capacity building in the area of skills training, professional development, access to higher education to uplift the social capital to make it much more productive to deliver the outcomes that we're looking for. And finally, I wish to bring attention to the urgency of this situation. In this 2021, we're going to have an entire trade negotiation agenda taking place globally. We're going to have the UNCTAD 15th session this year. We're going to have the WTO 12 Ministerial Conference. We're going to have the EU Caribbean Forum. We're going to have the post-Cotonou Agreement. We're going to have the UN Climate Change Conference, the COP26. We're going to have the UN Biodiversity Conference in China. All of these activities are going to be taking place in this 2021, and we have to bring results to shape those conversations. If we cannot somehow forge the results for concessionary funding, for looking at how to invest and bringing the Caribbean onto a more sustainable basis, bringing the Caribbean to a more competitive level, we are not going to get the benefits of any of these conversations in 2021, which would mean that 23, 24, we haven't actually have moved in any direction. So there's an urgency of now. These are very pressing issues for practical purposes. This is not an academic discourse about whether or not we should politicize the issue of concessionary funding. This is about what we have heard, an existential threat to the Caribbean that has been growing decade by decade by decade. And now COVID has blown the roof off the Caribbean house. And having blown the roof off the Caribbean house, when we look inside, we look and we can now see that what have been revealed has been concealed for decades. What has been revealed has been concealed for decades. That we are still trying to exit our colonial history, that we are still being punished for the audacity of building nations. And I agree with Minister Johnson. This region has done proud. It has committed to democracy. For 60 to 70 years since the independence process, we have committed to the democratic ideal. We have had elections within pandemics in recent years. Within a matter of 6 hours, we have declared results and a new government has been approved. All of these democratic commitments, the Caribbean has been a poster boy for how to deliver democracy in a difficult circumstance. But in spite of that, in spite of the history of being held down and exploited, we are still not getting the kind of relationship that we need within this hemisphere and within the world economy. And it is precisely that fact that we have to recognize our special ideal role. It was indeed in Haiti that delivered the first nation. It was Haiti in the Caribbean that said, let us end colonization. It was Haiti that said, let us build the first human rights society. Let us end slavery. Let us be the ideal for humanity. It is Haiti that turned around and was the role model for Latin America and helped Simon Bolivar to deliver his justice movements across Latin America. The Caribbean was there at the beginning. And where have we ended? At the end of this journey, we have ended in the circumstance where the Western world that never supported our development continues to see the Caribbean as a place that must not be treated for its commitment to justice, its commitment for democracy, and making contribution to the freedom of every country in this hemisphere. The Caribbean deserves better. It has a right to better. And I'm urging you, my friend, Luis, that this is not an intellectual discourse anymore. We've heard about the existential threat to these small groups of nations that were there at the beginning of modernity. And here they are at the end of modernity, post-modernity, and are still paying a price for their historic role. So we have a lot of work to do. This is not a call for special treatment for the Caribbean people. We in the Caribbean do not believe in the call for special treatment, but we do indeed insist upon fairness, upon justice, and upon doing what is right. Thank you very much, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sir Hilary Beckers, for your perspective on the issue and insight on the role of the Caribbean university sector's knowledge leadership and innovation in accelerating transformational development. What do we do with this concessional financing? Thank you very much. As we are coming to a close, I would like to extend my appreciation and thank to you, all the panelists and the organizers, and also the University of West Indies for hosting us. This event may be drawing to an end, but the conversation that we have sparked here today is sure to continue. As countries of the Caribbean, along with their fellow small island developing states, seek to accelerate their pathway toward recovery and beyond, determined action to enable access to development assistance is absolutely vital. As these countries and the world at large continue to be faced with complex challenges and risk, the field of development finance must reflect this reality. It has been an honor to be joined by this most excellent panel. I would like now to pass the floor to Mr. Luis Felipe Lopez Calva to deliver his closing remarks based on the discussion we had. Luis Felipe?
Thank you, Riyad. I think I will be very brief, just to thank all the participants, particularly Professor Kambur, with this very, very broad and deep, very detailed and rich introduction to the issue, the different perspectives, how to approach the introduction of risk into the classification, and Daniel, who presented also the work of ECLAC and all the different perspectives. I think we are left with the final message of Sir Hilary Beckles, in the sense that we have to go beyond the technical conversation, and I think the sense is that we have to really use as much as possible the institutional strength to support the Caribbean and in general middle-income countries in these conversations at the political level. I think that is the main message, and that is, I think, a commitment that we have with all the countries participating in this conversation. This is very important because this really will allow countries to recover more effectively from this pandemic and the economic and social effects of the pandemic. So I really want to thank everybody. It's unfortunate that we cannot continue right now the session, but as Riyad said, this is a dialogue that is going to be present for a long time. Certainly not only in terms of the dialogue, but hopefully to have concrete achievements and to look at how this can change the perspectives for policies in these countries. So thank you very much, Riyad. Thank you for good moderation, and thank you to all the participants. It has been a really rich and important conversation.